Welcome back to the part two of this Tower Bridge special. And yes, just chopping it up with the Professor Dan Juma and Brother Joseph Watfa. Brother Joseph, I wanted to find out if we could move towards the meat of your dissertation. What was how would you say, what were the main findings that you discovered in this paper that you wrote?
I mean, in terms of sort of offshoot of the conversations, one of the main findings, I guess, was that there were so many findings, and I ended up having to, really focus and situate myself within the field, and specifically in terms of race, racism, and resistance, and how that sort of influenced.
Key ideas, right?
Yeah, they're the key sort of the main focus of the dissertation. So, I mean, in terms of the most significant findings, I think we can go with sort of three sort of significant findings. I think the first one is sort of exposure to Islam. That's what I called it in the thesis, and that was the general, as I spoke at the beginning, and sort of as Brother Dan Juma said earlier, Islam's prevalence and growth in the West, Muslim communities, Arab communities, the rise of the proliferation of mosques, and sort of the double pronged sort of influence of 9/11, which had this real surge in the media about Muslims, all negative, but interestingly, most of the people I interviewed, that was one of their sort of points of just like, who are these Muslims? Like, why are they in the news every day? Why did they bomb those two towers? And that started a journey. And so that was a sort of minor finding. But then, in terms of sort of race, racism, and resistance, I think one of the main findings was I called it alternative history, alternative histories, and it was this notion that sort of while navigating sort of their way through British society and sort of in school with the police, they were, constantly sold this idea of, what it was to be black. It was this externally defined identity, they defined in some ways, and there was, you could talk about critical points, Rastafarianism, Ansarullah, the 5%ers, where, black people actually were out there, or, even hip hop, defining it. But then in many cases,
hip hop was profoundly influenced by the 5% nation.
Yeah.
Profoundly.
Yeah. I mean, you go on the Wikipedia page and you see all the names of hip hop artists, and it's, from Nas to Rakim, everyone.
Poor Righteous Teacher, XYZ.
Yeah. And so what it was, a lot of the people I interviewed speak about, being, as Professor Danjuma said, being almost, I wouldn't go as far as saying ashamed, but slightly embarrassed, not proud of their past, because for them to be black was to be, history started as a slave, and then you were rescued by, William Wilberforce, and missionaries in Africa.
Maybe it was some shame, actually. Maybe it was actually shame.
I guess it is. That a false history. Yeah. It was a false history,
but that's a powerful teaching against a person's humanity. Right?
Exactly, and from that basis of that construction of blackness, which took Yoruba, Igbo, Wolof, Timni people, and called them black,
Negro, actually.
Oh yeah, I mean Negro, and then
or even worse.
and then black, and so for many what Islam offered was sort of an alternative raw material. For many of them, they found, and these raw materials were found in the story of Mansa Musa, arguably the richest man ever to walk on earth, and they say the story is you can track his journey to Mecca because of the inflation he caused with his gold purchases throughout. Bilal, the first Muslim to give the call to prayer, and then up to Malcolm X and beyond. And so Islam offered this alternative notion of blackness, and then at the same time, sort of almost in a contradictory fashion, it offered this idea that in our sort of community, in the Islamic community, you're not black and you're not white, and race isn't the sort of most important identity. The most important identity is being a Muslim, and la ilaha illallah, and so.
Was that a consistent theme or a view, or amongst the people you interviewed, or was there contention, difference of opinion? Was that pretty much consistent?
I mean, there was obviously, it was pretty consistent in terms of I think there was in terms of a lot of the interviewees in my study are Salafi, and so sort of promoted this notion of a colourless Islam, an identityless Islam. You're only Muslim and everything else just gets binned. But then sort of as you probe in the conversations, you know, notions of race sort of come out time and time again, and that thing comes to them, that thing comes out over and over again, and it's the idea that, you know, you kind of don't know who you are, you know, or what you do know about yourself, you have to kind of find out yourself, you know, because everything you're being told, you know, from that basis of, you know, blackness to, you know, now, you know, they just say, they use the word gangster sort of interchangeably. Now you're a gangster, or you're whatever. And so for them, that was sort of the main part of the journey. I think another interesting finding in my study was sort of the notion of transformative justice, the power of Islam, you know, that they felt was devoid in black majority churches. Okay. You know, they really, I think, I mean, I can't really comment because I'm not sort of from the Caribbean community, but a lot of my interviewees said, you know, their parents, their grandparents who, you know, went to church were, you know, quite sort of passive in terms of their, you know, the resistance to racism. I think, you know, they've been pacified throughout, you know, their experiences, you know, beaten up, you know, in the 60s and the 70s, the NFs, and then, and what the sort of the black majority churches, they sort of, the way they spoke about it, it was this almost turn the other cheek culture, which, you know, a lot of the younger generation that I found, you know, weren't really sort of on the turn the other cheek culture. For them, they were British and this was their country, and they wanted to sort of find justice themselves. And so, I mean, one of the most interesting sort of quotes I remember, I can almost remember it off the top of my head, was one of the characters, one of the interviewees' characters, was he said, you know, he was looking around the black community in Britain, and, you know, the most successful elements of the black community in Britain were the Muslim black community, the West Africans and the Somalians specifically, and he was, you know, he was looking at it and say, you know, they own their own shops, they own their products, you know, they own, even, you know, you look at like Nollywood, for example, he spoke about, and he said, you know, that was a keen part, and for them, they a lot believed that Islam had the answers to, I call it, you know, black problematics in my dissertation, and what I mean by that is, you know, issues that, I mean, I'm not passing a value judgment whether true or not, but, you know, issues that, you know, African Caribbeans and, you know, non-sort of white people and everyone else in society, you know, sort of seems to say are issues in the black community, whether it be, you know, drug taking, you know, teenage pregnancies, which for me, statistically, they have no basis because they're societal issues, but then the way they're represented constantly in the media is you know, their black problems, street crime and whatnot, and for them, Islam offered, you know, almost direct answers to this, you know, no sex before marriage, and that would stop teenage pregnancies, you know, no alcohol, and that would stop, you know, that would influence violence, and so that was another sort of very important finding.
If we can just stick a pin, I saw the Professor smile when you mentioned, you quoted, paraphrased some of the people you interviewed saying that they discovered this Islam of no identity Islam, no, in the sense of a colorless Islam. Yeah. And I noticed that the Professor smiled. I just wanted to get an interjection from yourself about that type of idea in line of, you know, the history that you've come across.
When Malcolm X renounced the Nation of Islam, and people have this notion that Malcolm was struck colorblind on the road back from Mecca. And there's this feeling that Malcolm renounced racial politics and the politics of protest twinned with the politics of racial identity. Malcolm never did. Malcolm, in fact, formed two groups, as I'm sure is by now common knowledge, not just the Muslim Mosque Incorporated. Right. He also formed the Organization of African American Unity. He said, look, I don't expect, when I'm going on a march with Dr. Martin Luther King, because he attempted to mend fences with, he said, I don't expect everybody to be Muslim on that march. Yeah. And I can't be a Christian on that march. So that march is about people of African American origin. Yeah. But then, for people who want to practice Islam, the way Islam is understood in its best form, I formed a Muslim Mosque Incorporated. Right. So he tried to, I wouldn't say there was a bifurcation or a split in Malcolm's philosophy. I think Malcolm just recognized that there are two different levels on which these people are operating, and he was in both camps. Now, we face a lot of that as African Caribbean people. This notion is how to navigate, should we be more Muslim than Caribbean, or should we be more Caribbean than Muslim, or should we level switch as we see as the occasion demands? Yeah, because there are different challenges, right? And then when we level switch, we Muslims call us into question when we're being more Caribbean than Muslim, And then when we become more Muslim in the Caribbean people accuse us of being traitors to our race. So for the Caribbean person who's both Muslim and Caribbean, there is that dilemma.
There is this, so just to elaborate on that question, because there's a question that's come up recently in conversation, where it's an ongoing question, particularly, as I said, Thursday night, there was a couple nights ago, there was a big talk about Malcolm X, the 50th commemoration of his passing, of his martyrdom. And how can I put it? It's as if people struggle with both sides of Malcolm X, Orthodox or heritage Muslims struggle, both African heritage and non-African heritage, of reconciling those challenges. So there's an extreme discomfort about really African heritage, African Caribbean Muslims, for example, going back to their communities, to the non-Muslims, and bringing the message of Islam as a revolutionary force to revive and to improve the community and liberate the community. And in fact, some would actually say that African Caribbean Muslims, in some respects, post say 80s, 90s, are in some respects charged for abandoning the cause, whatever that, in one sense.
What do you like? I think there is some validity to that argument. Joseph, would you like to take up the thread of that question? I hope I haven't prejudiced your answer by what I've just prejudiced. But I think it's
no pressure.
to agree with me, but there's tremendous substance to what you're saying. I don't know, Joseph, what you thought.
I mean, in terms of sort of I think it's a sort of double pronged I think issue in the one sense that that you're sort of, I guess, even in terms of my research participants, they all sort of felt like this sort of pressure to sort of fight the fight and continue that fight. But then at the same time, I think what I found sort of extremely interesting from my study was the idea that the way the othering of sort of the black Muslim takes place within the community, and how that sort of leads to sort of an ostracization of sort of black converts, where I talk about black converts in my study as a thing, and as if race is, their race sort of separates them totally from the ummah, if that makes sense. So, and I think Brother Dan Juma said it at the beginning, there's this clash sort of constantly going on, whereby we're sold what it is to be Muslim in Britain, for example, all over the world, and that's sort of that mantra is directly accepted by the sort of the mainstream, so the media, and that's when you see a picture of a Muslim, it's very rarely a black man, it's usually an Asian or an Arab.
I think you could use the term normative.
Yeah, there's like a normative sort of community, which is, and that's even when people try to do good pieces of work, trying to talk about the complexities of Islam and talk about the Islam as a peaceful religion, or different things, they end up focusing specifically on Asians and Middle Easterners, and what that happens is you have this racialized conception of Islam, and that Muslims are Asian or Middle Eastern, and what happens is within the Islamic community, which is the majority is Asian and Middle Eastern in our society, they end up othering black Muslims as well, to the extent where black Muslim converts are always called converts. A black Muslim can have a convert can have a son, and they'll kind of always be labelled as a Reaver or a convert.
Yeah, I remember being at a function in South London, and could say, for use the term, heritage Muslim in some kind of, my daughter, she's only 12, but she at the time she recalled somebody referred to her. She heard of somebody over speaking and referred to her as a Reaver, and she's born as a Muslim. She's only known Islam. We never taught her anything. She's never been taught anything else. So she was absolutely livid and infuriated by being called a Reaver, because she doesn't recognize this term. And I guess the schizophrenia does start from, or I use that term, from older people who say, for example, older Muslims who have African Caribbean heritage. Sometimes you hear brothers talking, they'll say, yeah, it was quite a mixed crowd. There was Bangladeshi brothers there was Khoja brothers there, Moroccan brothers there, and there was like reverts.
Yeah, exactly.
And you think, okay, what the heck is that? Because I know if you take me Bangladesh, I know a language, I know a people, I know a history. And likewise, if you say Morocco, or you say Iran or Iraq, but when you say Reaver, you think, well, is there a revert language or a revert land, or and even just kind of cut off from your history?
Exactly, and then even that within sort of my study, I mean, I'm as guilty as this. As sort of the mainstream or even like the what we'd call the normative Muslim community, that you just went through a list there, you know, Bangladeshi, Lebanese, you know, Iraqi Muslim, Afghan, you know, Egyptian is Muslim, and then, but then, you know, when we sort of switch over to people from Africa or the Caribbean, you know, we willy-nilly just throw out the term black, and it's just, you know, that there's this, you know, all-encompassing identity that everyone with, you know, brown skin is black. And, you know, there is some truth in that. There is a shared history in some ways, but then there is also sort of tremendous and immense sort of diversity and complexity within the community.
Indeed.
So it's this almost double prompting where, you know, the media, the mainstream is representing sort of things in one way, and then people in marginal sort of social positions, whether they be Muslims or sort of African Caribbeans or, you know, etc., tend to sort of accept these things, and it sort of there tends to mediate sort of the, you know, the experience of different groups within sort of subgroups.
How was your dissertation? How was it received?
To be honest, I'd say generally quite positive. I mean, I was in quite a liberal institution within a slightly conservative university in quite a liberal country, if that like makes sense. I mean, yeah. I mean, so yeah, Sweden. I mean, their right-wing party, not the Nazis, but like it's quite, you know, doesn't sound too dissimilar from what we call, you know, our left Labour. So it is quite interesting. But, you know, I think there was a few, you know, ums and ahs, you know, why them, you know, what, you know, oh, why, you know, why them, why not this, why are you focusing on this and why are you focusing on that? And then what I did find actually to be quite...
So there was some tension then?
And no, I found, I guess like, sort of almost quite offensive at times is and this is something, it happens in quite a lot of, you know, sort of in a few sociological studies and anthropological studies, it's almost infantilization of, you know, the subjects that, you know, so a big part of my thesis was, you know, I wasn't going to bring any overarching sort of theory of conversion into the thesis, or sort of, and I was going to let sort of my interviewees, you know, dictate and define what conversion meant to them and why. Whereas, you know, a social science crowd were like, oh, you know, how could you let people who, you know, haven't studied what you've studied define this phenomena? And, you know, and my retort to that was, how can you attempt to define a phenomena that you haven't even sort of partaken in or have no experience in? So yeah, and it's this idea that, you know, that subjects, I mean, the late Stuart Hall sort of was big on this. It was like this degradation of the black voice in social sciences. And it's this idea that because my paper is, you know, very sort of, it relies massively on the interviews and not on sort of overarching theories by, you know, European philosophers and European social scientists, that it you know, it in itself is open to critique and not as, you know, empirically valid as it should be. So yeah.
How did you feel about that?
I mean, to be honest, the process from the beginning to the end for me was so, you know, rewarding, enlightening, illuminating, and not only in terms of like the subject matter, but in terms of like the way I began to see things outside of, you know, in my daily life. And, you know, the idea, you know, like I sort of relating to the question you asked me at the beginning in terms of how I began to sort of be much more reflexive in the way I saw things, because I went into this sort of this research thinking I kind of had all the answers because of my experience where I grew up, and, you know,
the fact
so
your own bias, you owned your own bias.
Yeah, and the fact that I was Muslim, I thought, you know, I was in, but then, you know, as soon as I got in, I realized that, whoa, like I actually know very, very little, and it was a humbling experience. And so I had the confidence, and I knew that the work I had done was what I intended to do, and what the people who I interviewed would have wanted me to write. You know, I wasn't in the business of, you know, taking sort of their assertions and the different things they told me, and, you know, trying to fit it within, you know, some Gramscian Marxist theory. I wanted to truly reflect what the individuals...
Authentic.
Yeah, I mean, as authentic as I could do.
Yeah.
But obviously, you know, you have to get to pass a master's, you have to obviously...
There's criteria.
Exactly.
We've been there.
The institutions.
Alhamdulillah. Professor, question comes to mind, because I'm linking and I'm moving between the two of you because it's so interrelated. Not the same, but so interrelated. When would you say, I'm going to use the term like this surgical almost removal of consciousness of when I say consciousness, in the term black consciousness or Afrocentricity or black consciousness. When was that removed from the Muslim landscape, the African Caribbean Muslim landscape? What epoch are we talking?
You know, I think that happened in the 80s. It happened as early as the 80s. Yes, there was still the politics of protest with NWA and these people, but to me, their blackness was a very regional, it was an urban blackness. Our blackness linked us back to the continent of Africa.
Okay.
When we became Muslim and we began to gravitate to, we moved away from the NOI, then we moved to things that looked a little more, looked authentic. It was very eye-catching. You mentioned it just now, the Ansarullah.
Mm-hmm.
When you saw them on the street,
Whoa,
they
man.
were immediately recognizable. Even in winter, they wear their thobes
and always in pure white.
Always in white. And they'll tell you straight, we are connected spiritually to the Sudan. This immediately connected. In fact, it is no surprise there for my first trip upon no sooner had I arrived in England to continue my studies, the first place I went to was the Sudan in Africa. Of all the countries that I chose to visit, it was the Sudan. And then from there, other parts of Africa. That's another story later. But what I'm trying to say is, when you look at the people that we are teaching us in Trinidad, and they recognize this from quite early on, most of our missionaries were West Africans. They sent Sheikh Salahuddin Tayo. He was from Nigeria but domiciled in Ghana, Yoruba man. And then one whom you know, Sheikh Bouadi, Sheikh Faisal Bouadi of the Islam Channel. He lived in Trinidad for 12 years. But they sent people like that because at that time we had connected. The brother Joseph was talking about Mansa Kanka Musa and that sort of history. That sort of history was very much uppermost in our minds. As a boy in Trinidad in the 70s, I never learned. The books I studied at school taught me that some of these people were Mohammedans. I'm trying to quote verbatim what the book said. Some of these West Africans are people from whom we descended as slaves, as like descendants of the slave experience. Some of these people were Muslims and were able to repeat parts of the Mohammedans, I think was the word, and could repeat parts of the Quran. The clothing they wore was large, loose-fitting, which they may have copied from the Arabs. That was what was devoted to Islam in West Africa when I was growing up. So like the brother Joseph said, the counter-narrative was we had to go to our libraries and research, and there was abundant material written by Trinidadian professors on the subject of Islam, like Professor Carlton Otley, like one of my priests. I studied at the Holy Ghost Fathers Institution in Trinidad. And one of the priests, Father de Vertey, he wrote about Muslims in Trinidad. He mentioned people who saw the Mandinka. They said the Mandinka who dress like priests because they wear little caps and shirts that button right up and smocks that go down to the ground. And this was as late as the 40s and 50s. So we began to, Rabita sent Sheikh Tayo, we began to link into an African interpretation of Islam. There's another reason for it. In Trinidad and in places like Guyana and Suriname, there's a large, as I mentioned before, Indian Muslim population. Now, they gave little dawah for the reasons I gave before. I think I explained this in the first part. Why it was difficult for them to reach out to the African population in Trinidad and in Guyana. So the African Muslim in Trinidad, having become inspirited with a notion of Islam or revivification from the American experience, Muhammad Ali the boxer, do not underestimate, sidebar, the importance of Muhammad Ali to the spread of Islam in the diaspora. We know about Malcolm X.
He said
Muhammad Ali the boxer, Cassius Clay.
Formerly known as Cassius Clay.
Formerly aka Cassius Clay. Yeah.
We are going to break for a short break. We hope to see you on the other side where we're going to keep it rolling. Until such time, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah ta'ala wa barakatuhu.